Today we're going to do a motion breakdown on EDC's finals motion. This house prefers a world where Stoicism is seen as the social norm. But let's first talk about what exactly we do with this house prefers motions. And I think the general approach is that prefers motions often require an active comparison between both sides. Both sides are probably expected to think of how their own world looks like. In this specific motion, government probably needs to do a lot more work in rebuilding the entire world, aka reimagine how exactly the world will now look like when everyone adopts Stoicism, how an average person will feel and how they react to events around them. And Opera probably explain and describe how status quo is like right now, that people often operate with emotions. Why are they likely to operate with emotions? Why is that necessarily a good thing? And so what? And I guess lastly, both sides will probably imagine doing prep of how each other's counterfactuals will look like and why the opponent's counterfactual is likely to be in a specific manner and why that's problematic for the reasons that each side suggests. And in this case, it probably will boil down to two things. The first is likely to boil down to a battle of framing, where often both sides will claim that individuals are likely to react or act in a certain manner. But then the question becomes, who is more likely to act in a certain way? How does an average human individual likely to react? Why is it more likely, etc.? And secondly, it's probably about weighing of outcomes, because at the end of the day, both sides are probably also likely to claim outcomes that sounds reasonable or equally possible of happening. Then the question is then, which outcome is more impactful or more likely to be impactful, and why do I need to care about that more? Yeah. So with all of those general things being said, let's go into the specifics of the motion. What was given in the info slide? And I think the info slide gave these two details. That Stoicism is a school of thought which teaches that first, people should not allow themselves to be controlled by the desire for pleasure or the fear of pain. And secondly, that people should not have strong emotional reactions to events around them, whether or not it's good or bad. So I think there is a high tendency of wanting to immediately zoom down to your own personal experiences, which is not wrong. And I think that's likely to happen when you as a secondary school student, you're likely to relate your own experiences. You're probably likely to link it to how you deal with very big things like your own major examinations, for instance, something that's probably quite a big thing in your life at that point. It is not a wrong approach. I mean, if debate is about personal experiences or like talking about people anyway. But it probably is good to think about what are the general problems that an average individual would face instead of locking yourself into those specific situations that you have. And that prevents the other side from claiming that you're too narrow or you're just being very specific towards specific stakeholders, I guess, to prevent those kinds of situations. Yeah. With that said, let's go with what the general case for prop could be. So generally, you probably ask questions like, what is life generally like for an average individual? And in the absence of Stoicism, how you like to react and why exactly is it harmful to them or to society or to whoever you want to protect. And the problem is likely to look like that an average person like you and I are likely to face various challenges that are often out of our control or often inevitable at various points of life, right? Some that requires us to make difficult decisions, or some are just very stressful in nature. And that probably look like, or likely to look like you as a student, for instance, having to prepare for a major examinations that will affect your ability to access what type of jobs you want in the future, or the types of tertiary education that you would like to access to, whether you want to settle down with someone for the rest of your life, what happens when you do, like your boss decides to fire you one day out of nowhere, etc. The point of all these illustrations being that often you as an average individual, are likely to face things that are often inevitable, or challenges are likely to be inevitable in your own life. So with the problem set up in mind, you would then think of how having or adopting Stoicism as a social norm changes these things. How is it better for the individual and perhaps for society? And I guess prop's general direction is probably be that when people adopt Stoicism, people are more likely to make better decisions because they're not likely to be caught up in the heat of the moment. They're more likely to be rational and think through things when they are making decisions, etc. And this is probably because of a few reasons. The first is that Stoicism probably inherently allows people to acknowledge that no happiness can be secure if it's rooted in very changeable or destructible things like external factors, such as those that affect our career prospects, for instance, or whether or not it affects our loved ones. The reality is that when we adopt Stoicism as a social norm, it also acknowledges and recognizes that we as individuals are in control of ourselves and of our emotions and our own decisions. So while it seems to be a more demanding way of life, the effect is it rewards us with the fact that we recognize that we are in control of our emotions and not having our emotions control us. And then you can probably think of like why that's probably better for the individual's like welfare. How does it like to play out in reality in various kinds of situations? And tell me about the impacts and why they're necessarily a good thing. But there's also perhaps a second angle, whereby adopting Stoicism also allows us to recognize the fact that we are in control of our happiness, and the key of our happiness is really in our own wills, and that affects the way we look at like society or like social issues, for instance. So for instance, if you're like the poor, you're probably likely to feel that you can get some meaning of life by really by probably prioritizing your time more of your own relatives or your own family or your own children instead of constantly being stressed over like monetary concerns. And often these concerns are dictated by like societal pressures and its emphasis on money, how it's linked to how often money is also tied to social status and how other people perceive of you. Basically, when you adopt Stoicism, you're likely to feel less pressured or less stressed by what other people perceive of you. Or like you're likely to care, or like you're likely to deal with external influences that are often out of your control better, by recognizing the fact that, like, I mean, very simply, that these are out of your control, and if there's any other things that you can do within your own life that you can gain meaning from. And that arguably could be better for you by first, like, I mean, making you less stressed over, for instance, by increasing the quality of life in that specific aspect and the mental health aspect. Also, perhaps the fact that you can be more productive at work, or the fact that you're able to derive meaning from other areas of life in other aspects that you probably would not have in the absence of Stoicism as a social norm. It also could look like within other settings, like the military, for instance, right? Where there's probably some argument of how soldiers can come to terms with their own reality when they adopt Stoicism, acknowledging it, learning how to better cope or deal with the challenging things that they have to do as soldiers, like having to like constantly engage in like I guess those really active ones, being engaged in war, for instance, having to shoot. Perhaps maybe you could argue that it reduced the extent of like PTSD, which is often quite a huge problem for soldiers in general, especially in the US. So I think all of these are like various kinds of impacts to consider how people's perspective change at the point in which they adopt Stoicism. So yeah, that probably is the general direction of the GAF case. What exactly is the OP case then? So I think there probably is some strategic possibility of analyzing why status quo is emotional, why people largely operate on emotions right now, and why that's a good thing. And there are really a few reasons or angles to this, and I think there are namely three here. The first is having some form of emotions, or like having emotions is good because first, it fundamentally encourages you to do better, right? So for instance, having some form of stress probably is good to pressure you to want to work harder and do better, because in absence of that, you're probably maybe likely to feel complacent or just unlikely to work as hard. And you probably have to explain to me why that's likely to be the case if you want to run that, or if you're running that, yeah. So I guess there's the concept of like eustress, for instance. There's a balance of stress, and I guess that's where GAF will come in and try to like, oh no, like you're likely to be too stressed. And then I guess it's back to the likelihood analysis of the debate. But secondly, that perhaps it makes you appreciate things or being able to derive more meaning from life. The fact that, for instance, when you feel and go through the process of stress, of like being upset, and when your results finally pay off, it makes you feel like there's something worth to live for, or there's something that you can constantly work towards to, and that adds in meaning to your life. The fact that you feel that you have accomplished something with your life. So that's the first. The second is how it can spark social movements, or how it can benefit the welfare of like minorities. And the problem is probably likely to be because when you adopt Stoicism, you're likely to accept, or like you as a minority is likely to accept your own disenfranchisement. Like you make do with what you have. For instance, you don't necessarily see what you can do or what you can improve from there. So that means that you're likely to like, so while it seems like it's a good thing, it doesn't necessarily seem like a good thing, because it doesn't necessarily lead to like improvements of quality of living. It just means that you're likely to just accept your own circumstance without actually feeling the drive or the need to want to create change. Or it's a lot harder, or even if you want to create change, it's a lot harder to compel other people to want to create change with you. Yeah. And the solution to that is, on at least on op, what you can do is when you operate with emotions, you can channel that kind of anger, and acting on it is what creates that change, or at least acts as an impetus for change. And it looks like actually voicing out your discomfort when you hear like things like racist remarks, I guess, for instance, to like being able to channel the kind of emotions to like tangible actions like marching and protests, etc. I think these are things that are inherent or unique in like creating change or like sparking social movements to get the kinds of benefits that you get today. And that all wouldn't have been possible in the absence of emotions, for instance. But lastly, that emotions is the only common human language, right? Often people like you and I are often differentiated from various experiences. The fact that we could be speaking different languages, we're from different races, we have different faiths or different socio-economic classes. And often emotions is the only thing that binds us together. And that applies even logic differs because often they're quite subjective, and it's based on what you're exposed to, based on the kinds of friends you're exposed to, or how you're raised, for instance, or what you've been reading. And logic is often also quite subjective in itself, right? That often is also up to various kinds of interpretations. But emotions serve as the common factor. And that means that you don't have to experience the exact same thing as someone to empathize with them, right? For instance, when you see in a poster where a kid is like starving, you're likely to feel angry or upset because it's just not nice, or like you yourself would not like to go through the kind of experiences, and therefore you feel disturbed emotionally by it, and that, or you think that stuff is just painful and no one has to go through that. I think all of these things, that emotions uniquely serve as a common factor in order to get people to understand, or like being able to even relate on a even if you don't necessarily go through similar experiences, or even if you don't necessarily speak similar languages, for instance. And in reality, you see this around, right? Where like charities often use emotive images, for instance, to get people to start donating or start volunteering, because it's the most direct way to show people what their plight is like. And this is the most direct way in order to engage people, for instance, or even looks like how minorities often then also try to gain traction or garner support for their own social movements, for instance. I think all of these things are likely to be illustrations that op is likely to use in this debate. So that concludes the op case. I think probably some strategic things to note is that I guess what Gav could do is probably like scope the debate. So like, for instance, maybe where emotions are likely to be too high anyway, that's probably unlikely where the debate exists. And then tell me where exactly likely the debate is likely to exist, and then go on to give me the argumentation, etc. So I guess that's just some additional strategic things. But yeah, I think if not, that actually concludes what I have for today. And I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to I have no idea, but like I hope you all find this helpful and have a great week ahead. Great. Thank you so much.